It's really a pleasure to be here and talking about something that was one of my passions in recent years, and something that I've really come to enjoy the full process of, and that's something that I wanted to share. I struggled a bit in trying to come up with exactly how I wanted to frame this talk, whether or not I should go into kind of the nitty-gritty details or give a more full-blown look at everything that might go into this. And I decided I'd go into the inch-deep, mile-wide type of approach and cover all of the different things that people might enjoy. My goal at the end of this is to show you all of the different complexities that go into running a game, as well as hopefully convince a couple of you to possibly try it out. So with that, I just want to cover a little bit of my background as far as how it helps out in discussing this talk. Like many folks, I grew up playing video games all through my childhood. It was something that was a great activity for me. I formed bonds with all sorts of games and really enjoyed just playing and learning the lessons that they had for me. But beyond that, it was an activity. It was something that I enjoyed. It was not something that I had intended to turn into kind of a lifelong passion. My first foray into more competitive, focused gaming occurred in my teenage years. I became part of the Super Smash Bros. Melee competitive community in the mid-2000s, and that was transformational for me. It's something where I was good. I was not great, but it was something that let me travel to tournaments. I could meet up with all sorts of people, get different perspectives on that, and really some of my best memories are part of that. But back on the real-life side of things, I went through and started my schooling, got master's degrees in computer engineering and cyber operations. As far as how that applies to the talk, it really is just my note of I have a formal background in engineering, software development, as well as reverse engineering and, let's say, knowing how to treat software creatively to try and get certain things out of it. And I'm very fortunate to be able to continue that in my professional work with MIT. But really what we're here to talk about today is the speedrunning side of things. And this is something that I started up because I missed out on all of this kind of competitive aspects that I had to drop when I started school of Super Smash Bros., but I also had this deep nostalgia for all these games that I played as a kid, and speedrunning was my way to actually dive into that. And over the course of the last 10 years or so, I've completed speedruns of more than 24 different games, and most of which from scratch. So I'm hoping to kind of share some of those lessons today as we go through more of the talk. But that's the main thing. What we're talking about today is, of course, video games. And we'll differentiate that online, usually by just putting it as one word instead of two to differentiate it from athletic running. But what we're talking about here is completing a game quickly. The duration of this usually goes from the time that you press start until the time the credits roll. And what I'm going to be talking about today is all things performed by hand. All things that are done without tool assistance. There are other types of speedruns that are performed with tool assistance, and they're really interesting. They have a whole bunch of other different things to them, but for the lessons that I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to be just focusing on the human element of things. Some other important lingo as we go through this is category. And when a speedrunner or anybody else talks about a category, they're really talking about the rule sets, the restrictions, and the goals that they're trying to perform this run under. And this is really important because it'll differentiate something, a speedrun done with no restrictions versus one that's done towards complete item collection or restricting different techniques that you might be able to use. So that's what it is. Why would you want to do it? What a lot of people see is the competitive aspect. It's something that if you get good enough, you can claim that you are the best in the world at something. And that's certainly worth of bragging rights. There's a real sense of accomplishment that comes from that. But I would say that that's actually kind of in the minority of primary motivations and why you'd want to get involved. What's a much bigger piece of that is actually diving into the community side of speedruns. So one of the things that is really good for newcomers is that as you come in, there's all sorts of people who will be supporting you, who will be commenting on you, enjoying your own progress as you go through and try to challenge yourself, reach new goals, and really test your own limits. And that's kind of the most fulfilling part. And a lot of people are drawn to that. They don't necessarily need to be the best in the world, but they really want something that will let them play the games that they love and enjoy it in a brand new way. And that's what speedruns help to accomplish. But why would you choose speed as a particular challenge? Why not score or some other difficult type of challenge in the game? Well, that's where things get a little technical. Speed is important because it has a number of different trade-offs that really they increase the difficulty of performing it at the human level. And one of the examples that I have for this on the chart on the left, this is just a quick graph showing the time taken to travel 1 mile as you increment speeds. And the thing to note here is that as you're going forward, you're actually encountering diminishing returns. So for each additional unit of speed, let's say that it took the same amount of effort to increase 1 unit of speed as it goes, you're actually getting less and less benefit the further along it goes. And that's really important when you're trying to, let's say, save small fractions of a second, because that means that for every new small amount of time that you're shaving off, that's a huge amount more effort in order to get to that next step. The other side of things, if you treat the game as just a black box, and you're sending inputs to it to try and achieve some optimal goal, some state within the game that is going to tell you you've succeeded. This is a classic state explosion problem. Even in a game that only responds to 2 different inputs, you have a case of just even for 1 second of gameplay, you're looking at 120 bits of possible paths to search through and try and get that. That's on par with some of the cryptographic block ciphers that we have today. And that's just not happening. But of course, you can cut that down, use intuition to try and limit the number of paths that you need to search. But at this point, it's not even really playing the game. This is trying to treat it as an optimization problem. And this is actually a really important point that I want to draw some more attention to. So we're going to take a slight break and go into something a little different. Let's talk about art. So this is a particular image from artist Tatsuo Horiuchi. And I am just about the last person that you want talking anything about art and characteristics, but it seems perfectly competent. It's pretty. It's in some piece of art in an East Asian style. It seems fine. I'd be happy to have this up in my home. The caveat on this particular piece of art is that it was created in Microsoft Excel. And this is just about the last thing that people would expect to use from Microsoft Excel. This is a program built up entirely around data tabulation and organization. And you have Mr. Horiuchi here is using it to set up all sorts of things to create this fantastic picture. And this just goes to show that just because Excel was created to work with numbers doesn't mean you can't do other things with it. And in fact, it has all the functionality that he needs there to create something like that. And he's not the only one. There's hundreds of other people who will do art in Excel just because it has the tools available and it's something that they can easily get to and work with. Might not be as powerful as Illustrator or something else meant for that purpose, but it is effective and it still lets people reach their creative expression and create the products that they want. So what about speedruns? What a lot of people, casual observers and other people who are watching speedruns, a lot of their first impressions are, that's not how I played the game. That's not what the developer intended for the game. And in a lot of ways, they're right. That doesn't really matter, though. The goal here is to create an optimized solution through the game. The game itself, the narrative, all of the different elements that the developers put into it to try and make an experience, don't matter as much. It's still the game, but they're more concerned with this is the world, these are the rules that I need to work within to try and reach my end destination. And that's really what's going on here. But if the speedrunners aren't bounded by the rules set by the developers, what are they bounded by? And this is where we go into a lot of other topics dealing with how speedruns should be organized, what constitutes a valid speedrun, how do you make things comparable. For example, even the timing methodology is something that varies pretty significantly by the different games. Some of the major timing methodologies are listed on the right side vaguely, but the main thing is that what you're measuring, even though you're getting a metric of time, what you're measuring is actually the skill of your performance. And it's always important to keep that in mind as you're trying to set up these different qualifications on what's happening. And as you look through some of these other topics, really what we're doing is this is all experimental design. You want to create something that is comparable between different people performing under the same set of goals and restrictions so that you can determine, is this run better? Is that run better? What is the skill that they use to accomplish this? And that's largely what happens with speedrun organization. But that's just the highest level look at kind of how speedruns are formed, talking about everything that a speedrun is. From here on, I really want to talk about how to do a speedrun. And that's kind of where the meat of things is, and really the most interesting parts. The general process that I devised and really espouse in this is going through a three-phase approach. You start out with investigation, where you're trying to understand what is the game that I'm working with? What are its limits? What can I do? You take that knowledge and you apply it once you get to routing, where you actually make the decisions. You want to come up with, here's my path. These are the set of decisions that I'm going to respond to, and really what I believe to actually make an optimal solution going through this game. And then finally, you get to execution, because just having a theory about what's fastest isn't good enough. You need to actually put it through the end, make your best attempt to reproduce that particular route, and then go from there. This is not a waterfall style approach, though. There's all manner of things that you might find, and you're going to wind up going back to earlier parts just so that you can either increase your understanding, make some different decisions when something doesn't work out right, and really still, at the end, you're always getting to this point of doing the run. And that's kind of the important piece. So what I'm going to go through here is just some of the major topics in each of these as we go through. So investigation, a lot of people will skip over investigation, or they won't give it the proper credit due, just because it's not the most glamorous. Really what you're trying to do is catalog data. You're trying to build up your own knowledge pool as you're going through, and making sure that you actually document it correctly, putting it into notes, making sure it's communicated out so other people can follow the same thing. But this is basically the entire phase where you're understanding the game. And that understanding is really what you're going to be exploiting as you go through each individual step. But for understanding, you really have to first understand what else is out there. And the very first thing that you should do is just go out there and find what is known. This might be kind of an obvious step, but really the depth that you go through this is kind of surprising to a lot of people. Obviously, you start with seeing if there's other speedruns. And I'm not just talking about speedrun videos. Find out if there's other comments, other posts, anything that's actually indicative of the thought process that a person went through in planning a speedrun. It's all very important because you'll be able to work with that and go from there. The second level, where you're still going to find a lot of useful information, is just the general guides for a particular game. So the player's guides, anything online, game guide related, different fan franchise sites will have a lot of useful information that other fans have cataloged, maybe not for the purpose of a speedrun, but it's data to you. So you're going to take it in all the same. Where a lot of people miss out is actually in these tier 3 types of resources. And the way that I've set up the tiers is just the likelihood that you're going to find useful information. But in the same way, you might find some of the most interesting stuff when you start to really stretch the limits of what you're looking at. So finding any other related gameplay videos. There's actually a lot of times then that people are doing a Let's Play and they'll do something weird and like, huh, I didn't know that would happen. And a speedrunner will come along and like, I can use that. And it's really important to kind of go through that steps. But international sites is also something that really doesn't occur to a lot of people. In some of my own research, I was working on a game called Front Mission Gun Hazard, and it's a Japanese-only game. So of course, most of the resources there are going to be in Japanese on the other side of the internet that I don't go to very often because I can't read it very well. But in actually doing the due effort and going over there, I was able to find a lone page on some fan site squirreled away that described a particular glitch. And it had enough details in there that I was able to figure it out and reproduce it, and that actually ended up getting used in a speedrun to pretty good effect. So that was my story about really going the extra mile and trying to investigate that. But this is all about everything that is known. What do you do for the things that aren't known? And for that, we go back to our good old friend, the scientific method. One of the biggest things that is really exciting about this part is the raw discovery of what it is that you're looking at. So just imagine that all of physics, everything that we knew about physics was wiped clean. Like, you could still tell that when you throw a ball, it's going to follow some sort of arc, but you don't know the mechanics behind it. You don't know, let's say, what the constant of gravity is or anything else like that. That's something that you do every time that you step into a new video game, and you're really trying to figure out, how do these things interact? What are the rules that govern how they actually work? And for that, the scientific method is perfect for actually going through and figuring out the individual things. And for many of us, this is something that we don't get the chance to use in our daily lives. It's something that they taught to us in middle school, and we knew it enough to pass the test, but getting an actual opportunity to exercise it is something that, for everybody I've talked to who's tried to experience this, is really rewarding when you actually come through and you figure out, wow, that particular formula works this way, or I didn't know I could influence it with trying to just run up and kick a wall or something like that. And really, you just follow the same steps of identifying what it is that you actually want to know, developing a hypothesis, setting up an experiment, and then ultimately trying to analyze the results of that experiment and decide how it actually impacts things. And that's how you build up all of the knowledge that isn't already known and written down elsewhere. But this has helped a little bit simply because you're living in a land of software, which means that everything in that world is going to be bounded by the restraints of software, and really everything is governed by some amount of math. And that's really everything. For a lot of casual players, they don't realize that, let's say, the power-up state of Mario in Super Mario World is actually governed by a single address that is responding to whatever that value is. All right, that's interesting to know, but why would I care about that as a speedrunner? Well, it just so happens that that particular value goes into an index, into a big table that you might be able to do some funny things with, and you get some fantastic results, just so long as you know the math and fundamentals behind that. Beyond that, some of the other things that you kind of take for granted are still governed by different calculations. For example, a typical hitbox scenario, and this is basically when two objects deciding whether they're colliding or not, is simply whether two squares are overlapping on a Cartesian map. Something relatively simple to do and implement, but it's not immediately apparent simply because of all of the artistic work on top of the game that's going on. And then, of course, there's also just the regular formulas. The Final Fantasy V sword damage formula is illustrated there at the bottom. And the important part is knowing all of the different pieces that go into it, but as a speedrunner, you will absolutely need to know what all of those different factors are and how best you can optimize it so that you wind up with enough damage to take out that boss in a certain number of turns. And that's the kind of thing that you're going to try and look for. The last thing in investigation, and this is probably the most fun for a lot of people, is discovery. So once you start to know what those limits are, you can really start to push them and find out other ways to use and abuse the game beyond what anybody really expected. This covers everything from using basic aspects of the game. For example, in Mega Man 4, if you take damage from an enemy, you have a brief period of vulnerability afterwards. Well, you can abuse that brief period of vulnerability and interact with things that would otherwise instantly kill you for as long as you're invulnerable. So you can use that to your advantage and skip through some things that would otherwise not be very polite. There's also instances where if you know the fundamentals of how the game is actually operating, in this case, the random number generation sequence of a game, you might be able to actually exploit that so you can make what would be a lucky occurrence into a consistent occurrence. And that's something that we're getting much more exposure to recently as people really dive into what makes the games tick and seeing just how much a human can interact and influence. The last thing that I want to discuss here is actually illustrated by that picture on the right side. And I really love this picture. This is from a glitch exhibition for a game called Ocarina of Time. And really, every time that you look at this picture, you will find something new that is just out of place. Even if you're not familiar with the game, you can probably tell there's a whole bunch of things in here that aren't going right. 21 hearts, 37 keys, sold out. What the heck's going on here? And what's wonderful about this is that this is all stuff that is achieved within the bounds of the game. You have a player who is going through and manipulating a game in such a way to make all of these crazy anomalies that nobody would normally encounter into a reality. And it's the fact that you can stretch a game to those limits that is really exciting to a lot of people. Next up is routing. And this is where you put all of that information, all of that extra work and investigative knowledge to use. And really what it comes down to is trying to solve the puzzle of the game. And this goes at the full scope of start to finish, as well as going down to much smaller levels, the individual rooms, the individual patterns that you're going to need to go through in order to reach the end solution. And this is particularly difficult, especially as a game has a lot of different variables, has a lot of different options that you need to try and take into account. There's a lot of different planning methodologies and strategies that really make this successful. One of the main ones that I try to work with and tell people to follow is actually the engineering design process. And this is one of the standard ways that an engineer will go through looking at a product that they want to design and going through an iterative process so that they can improve upon it, meet the needs, and also still satisfy a variety of conditions. It's kind of weird to think about a speedrun as a product, but really it works really well here because you're going through, you're trying to identify a solution set, and then you're trying to make that solution set work within your own constraints. This covers a similar process to the scientific method. The particular version of it that I've set up here goes through identifying, actually making sure that you know what it is that you're trying to solve, because that can get away from you a lot of times, enumerating what's possible, comparing them, and then ultimately testing it and making sure that it works within the full scope of all the other solutions that you've come up with, and then finally using that and communicating it either in text, in making a video of it, or actually doing it in a speedrun. So that kind of enumerates the full process, and it's really important to try and follow this and identify what is going to make a particular path fastest and best to try and work with. One of the other common aspects is resource management, and this is something that a lot of people treat as fairly obvious, but it becomes a really complex piece of the puzzle when you start to have to make trade-offs. And in this case, you might have an opportunity to, let's say, spend health. Health is an important resource. It's something that you can actually trade in a lot of games for time. You can try and save time by using your health, something that you're trying to otherwise conserve and keep up as high as possible to reduce risk. In the same way, you might have other expendable resources, illustrated in this by bombs, but you have the trade-offs of, well, if I keep more bombs, how can I use those to save time later? How much is a bomb worth in terms of the time that it saves? And this can be used to offset risk, trying to make, let's say, a boss fight easier or a next stage a little more consistent, things like that. Time. Time is also an important resource. And this is in the context of, if I spend more time now, will I save more time later? It's all trying to make this great weight measurement about what's actually going to get you through optimally. And it's a lot to keep track of. But when you come up with something that feels good, it's just that much more satisfying. When you identify something that trades off all the risk, gets you through optimally, and you're still looking at a good run, you know, resource management is really what comes out on top as far as how you distribute your actions. One of the least recognized pieces of actually planning out a speedrun is actually working with consistency. And consistency in this case is everything that has to do with making sure that you actually go through and succeed in at the very least the worst case, but most often the average case. And this is just an example for this. Let's say that there's a four-way stop. You need to travel from home and go do your groceries you need to go do some chores at the bank, the grocer, and the post office. You need to visit all three, return home. The distances to all of them is approximately the same. How would you actually make sure that you proceed optimally, assuming that you don't know, let's say, what the traffic is on the roads, you don't know the actual light pattern, you have no guarantee that it's going to be green when you're going to it. So what kind of things can you do to increase your consistency in getting through faster? And that's a large part of what consistency planning is. So you can, in this particular example, start to think about, well, if I can do a right turn on red, so I'm going to basically skip out on most of the times that I would otherwise get stopped by only a stoplight. If I avoid left turns, so I don't have to worry about oncoming traffic, that'll also increase my consistency in actually getting through quickly. And these are some of the other things that you really need to think about, making it successful. There's an example in a game called Castlevania Symphony of the Night that there is a strategy that, if done successfully, saves 10 to 20% off of the current fastest time. And this is a very competitive game. The caveat is that to execute this successfully, you at the very least need a 1 in 4,100 chance. Nobody has done this yet. Nobody has even really tried. And it's just one of those things that even if you know something is faster, if it's not going to ever work out so that you're going to keep your sanity while trying to do these attempts, then yeah, you're probably not going to try to incorporate it. The last thing we want to talk about is execution. And this has everything to do with how you're actually able to perform in the game. How are you able to play at a high level, do human level optimizations, and understand how it is that you're going to be able to practice and reinforce these things mentally. When a lot of people are getting started or just watching speedruns for the first time, they see these people doing incredible things in these games and like, wow, I'll never be able to do that. They're superhuman. They've got all these gifts and the abilities, and they're able to complete the game so fast. It's not something I'd be able to do. Well, at the end of the day, no. Nobody is really superhuman here. They've just trained excessively. They didn't get their abilities by coming into contact with a radioactive spider. It's much more along the lines of they've put in a whole lot of work. They've done the training, they've done all of the practice necessary to actually reinforce these things that they're doing, and then to really cut down on the overhead of their own actions. And for that purpose, it's much more like trying to be a ninja. You're trying to be an average person who just happens to be very trained in a particular thing and do particularly well. And this is something, there's a lot of strategies to actually do this, starting first and foremost with practice. And really what we're talking about when we mention practice is you're trying to learn. Practice is all about trying to learn how your body works, trying to learn how you're going to respond in certain situations, making that really into an automatic mechanism so that when you come across something, you don't think about it, you just do it. And there's a lot of different pieces of psychology that are important here, trying to set up appropriate chunking strategies, trying to work with scaffolding. And there's many different aspects to trying to train effectively so that that training isn't lost, so that you actually improve faster. And it really is just about understanding your own brain. But even beyond that, once you have the practice in, once you've built up the muscle memory, there's a lot of things that you really need to do to rely on the game to synchronize up those actions. And this is where various cues come in. So you're looking for things in the game, things that you generate yourself or just get a feel for to actually set up your actions so that they actually work within the realm of what you need to do. There's a lot of good examples for this in Super Metroid where just by complete chance, there are plants, foreground objects, other things that you can look for that you can use to identify where I need to execute a particular move, where you need to jump off a wall and get up to somewhere that you're not supposed to. All sorts of things like this that you can rely on to help you sync up what you're doing. There's another example with Mike Tyson's Punch-Out where the developers actually made a dynamic audience in the background that otherwise doesn't do a whole lot. You're primarily focused on the fighter, but while the fighters are doing certain things, they included cues in that audience that help you to identify when you're actually supposed to start up a counterattack, when you're supposed to do a dodge. Some of these examples, they're pretty hard to see in this particular pictures, but there's a guy flashing a camera at a particular point that you're supposed to counterattack. There's another one who drops his glasses. And all these little extra details that the developers actually included really help out in trying to identify how you're going to counter these otherwise difficult threats. But even beyond visual things, audio is really important. And this is important not only from a reaction speed standpoint. You can actually respond to audio about 20 to 40 milliseconds faster than you can visual cues. But it's also just really important in terms of knowing, let's say I'm in a boss area, that boss is going to spawn at a particular time, and the music just so happens to be synced up with that. in this case, in a game called Hagane, which I run, where you're using a particular part of that intro sound sequence to know when to start to launch your attack, so that you can get a very powerful attack in right at the beginning when he's first coming out. One of the last things that I really want to discuss is that what you're doing is a performance. It's a complete execution of your route, and as part of that, you will also have instances where you're getting into your mind, where you are starting to doubt yourself, where you're trying to actually keep up with a high level of play as you're going through. And what's actually shown along the bottom there is a heart rate graph of, this is my heart, going through a speedrun of Skyblazer, which is the first game that I've speedrun. And each of those instances, as you're going through, you can see that it gradually increases. And I'm just sitting down. This gets up to the point of moderate exercise, all while I'm in a chair, just because I'm trying to rectify whatever is going on with the screen and keep up my composure so that I can continue to perform optimally. And that's really another thing that comes in with conditioning, trying to do these runs over and over again. You identify, here's my best strategy for trying to calm down. Here's how I don't start to mess up simply because I've put too much effort and thought into what's going on the screen. And it's a significant part of it when you're going through and your heart's racing, you got the adrenaline pumping, all of that. But it's another really fun part of a speedrun. If you're able to get through the end, you get a great release. It just feels amazing. Even if you drop a run right at the end, it can still feel really rewarding that you've done so well and that you know I can get there again. So that covers the overall process. Here is just a dump of a whole bunch of other topics that kind of fit into these general parts of the phases. And really what I just wanted to show here is that what I've talked about today is just scratching the surface. There's so much to optimization, to planning, to proper presentation of facts and details about games that really there's something for everyone. Even if you're not intent on trying to go for a world record or anything like that, like you can enjoy the routing process, coming up with a solution. You can enjoy breaking apart a game, finding out what makes it tick, and then exploiting those boundaries, taking it to something further. And still you can enjoy the practice properties, improving yourself, coming up with a real product that shows iterative improvement. So just to wrap up everything related to the speedrun process, really my main recommendation is if you're getting started, even if you're already a conditioned runner, really you want to try every step. Try every bit of the phases, even if it's a game that's been done to death, just so you know what you enjoy. You can find all sorts of things as well as improve your own understanding of what you're doing and increase your enjoyment on top of that. And really, to get the most satisfaction about this, you want to be trying to push yourself. Don't necessarily just shoot for a record because it's there. You really have to make it something that is worth the effort that you put into it and something that you can be proud of after the fact beyond simply being the top of a leaderboard. And also never forget that you have a great opportunity here to work with others. There's a very supportive community all around who's willing to help, who's willing to support, and just watch your runs, and something to be, it feels great to be a part of. I want to end out with just a quick discussion of where speedrunning actually is today. As a practice, it really is something that's only blown up within the last 10 years or so. This particular chart is showing the total amounts raised and the average viewership of what are known as the Games Done Quick events. And these are twice annual events that are entirely speedrunning focused, but they're benefiting a particular charity at each event. And it's something that has really kind of exploded in popularity, but it mimics the growth and attention that's been given to speedruns as it's going through. If this graph included this year's numbers, we'd also see the trend continuing. And it's one of the things that's the most rewarding to me is that this is a hobby with video games that's actually making a difference in the world. We raise millions of dollars simply because people enjoy watching it and are particularly generous with appreciating the skills going into it. And that's something that I honestly find particularly wonderful and is really rewarding beyond just doing the speedruns itself. And that kind of wraps up everything. Everything that I've talked about today is a subset of some of the topics that I address in a book that I've been working on for quite a long time now, called Speedrun Science, and it tries to break down every little bit of it. In addition to discussing the actual process, it goes into the philosophy, some of the history of how it actually evolved and became more important, and finally, it'll be available in just a few weeks for pre-order, probably arriving at people's doors somewhere around February. A special thanks to Carrie Fry, who's my illustrator for the book. She provided many of the illustrations that you're seeing throughout the slide deck as well, and Tony Kuchar, who's my layout editor, also produced a number of these graphics. So special thanks to them and the rest of the Fangamer crew for working with me in the production of this book. With that, I'll close it out. You can reach out to me at any of those social media or mail addresses at the bottom. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So I have some questions from people who aren't in the office right now.
Mm-hmm.
First, save the Yoshis?
No.
And second, question from Iowa. What's the weirdest way you've seen someone discover a trick?
The weirdest way? Oh, man. So there's a particular game called Dragon View on Super Nintendo. And this game, oh my. A friend of mine was working on the speedrun for this game, and at a particular part, we discovered a bug that had not prior been known. And the only way that you execute this bug is simply that you haven't turned off the game after completing a certain story element, and then you reach another story element. You were expected to take a break somewhere in the middle, and you never would have seen this happen. But they have left some dirty memory somewhere, and what actually ends up happening is a huge, oh my, it's a very scary bug. It allows you to overwrite the entire memory contents, even going up, tries to start fiddling with ROM. Does a lot of very interesting things, but this was discovered completely by accident, simply because they were trying to go through the game all in one sitting. And it actually turns out that if you get the exact magic conditions, you can make this warp you into the ending credits, so that you can effectively, you have a choice between, if you try to play it completely like this, you either completely crash the game, or you make it to the end. And it was just a really interesting find. If you want details, I can describe that afterwards, a little bit more about what's actually going on under the hood.
I think I saw a speedrun for Half-Life 2 that worked by saving and reloading the game, such that when you reload the game, you're in a different position. And the video for those runs were edited, so you can only see the gameplay. Is that something that's a specific category, as you mentioned the categories before?
That would be a segmented run for the most part, especially if they're removing kind of the in-between. But it really is up to how the community defines what is challenging, what you're actually trying to show. And in this case, let's say that the Half-Life 2, simply by saving and quitting is what actually alters your position, then that's something that you can use in what's called a single segment run, and done in one sitting. But most often for those kinds of things, it's going to be segmented in that you do a block of it, try to get it as optimal as possible. In that save, you're going to bring it up again and do another one. Whether or not it's allowed or expected is really up to the game, and it really depends on how the game interacts with those saves. All right. Thank you so much for coming today. It's my pleasure to talk.